Izzy Martin, and I'm going to be making a presentation about a much shorter and less technical in many ways presentation, because in fact, my expertise on this is more from a policy perspective than necessarily a expert. I am not an attorney. However, we at the Sierra Fund have spent quite a bit of time thinking about what's the liability associated with these sorts of mines and mine sites. And that's a key piece of our new tools toolbox that we've tried to create to help be realistic about taking on this huge challenge of California's abandoned mines. As you know, we have been really clear on that we need to do improved due diligence, improved informed assessment. That means we really need to look at these lands carefully, not using magical thinking. And why we have really started this issue was that many times now, over many years, the Sierra Fund has become aware of abandoned mine land properties, which were just gorgeous. Here's an example of one. This is the Sierra Buttes. That's the upper and lower Sardine Lakes. These are all fake lakes. They were built for gold mining. There are gold mines all over this area up there. It's the very top of the Yuba watershed. But when we and others very excitedly helped gather the funds together to purchase this beautiful place, which was threatened to be turned into some other kind of use, we didn't really think about looking at the property ahead of time. We didn't really look around. I had raised my kids there. I thought I knew every inch of it. So the land got purchased. There's many times this has happened over the last several years where the assessment that was done didn't really look for things like water quality discharges. And in fact, the physical hazards, we had an abandoned mine land property owner tour us around one time, thinking it was interesting and fun to throw rocks into sort of a bush, and then you'd hear that it had gone down a shaft, and then you'd count how long that rock went until you heard the splash. There's been a lot of properties purchased for conservation activities, state lands, public lands, and unfortunately, some of these properties have a discharge, like Empire Mine. They've been working on that for a very long time. Here's the usual disclosure you get when you buy a piece of property, no matter where you are, no matter what's on it. Almost every single escrow report includes this term right here, that no California law requires the disclosure of abandoned mines in real estate. So the rest of it is all, therefore we don't have to. So this is a policy problem right up in our face. So the informed assessment lets you, the potential property buyer, get a real good look at the things we've been talking about. Is there conditions on the property that mean you won't be able to develop it? Is it going to cost more to clean up than you're going to be able to make? Another piece of informed assessment that is always very typical, in fact, it's hand in hand with an informed assessment, is figuring out who the responsible parties are, i.e., what happened on this site, who owned it then. Often there's insurance records, old mine maps. There's a lot of information available about some of these old sites here. This is the old Idaho Maryland mine in downtown Grass Valley. And the responsible party is often, by default, the current property owner, and unless there's unusual circumstances. And it's the property owner, even if they didn't create the hazard, even if they didn't profit from the mining operation. If they're a mining operation that came onto an abandoned mine property and makes it worse, that's a whole different story. But if you're an innocent property owner and you suddenly discover you own a mine, so there's different kinds of hazards. It's a good idea to have figured out ahead of time. If you own the mine now, it's not too late. It's really important to figure out what kind of hazards there are, because not only are there health implications, but of course, there's liability implications. The type of hazard on your property, if it's a visible hazard like adits or shafts or debris control dams, tailings ponds, unstable piles of rock, those are pretty normally visible, although people do sort of ignore them. Subsidence is another issue. On my breakout room earlier, we met the guy who bought he called it the fell in the hole pit house. He's bought a house that had collapsed into a pit from subsidence. So you can be far away from the mine, not realize you're on on top of an abandoned mine land, and then find out the hard way. The chemical risk is what we've been focusing on more because it's harder to see, harder to understand. There's on-site exposures, which are sort of related with dusty exposures. This here is a picture of the OHV, the off-road vehicle motor dirt bike trail in Forest Hill, which is built through asbestos-laden rock. So that's an on-site type exposure, or discharge. It's coming out a pipe and going into the water. There's two kinds of toxic discharges that cause you liability problems. The first is water quality discharge. The new or current property owners of the mines that have the discharge are responsible for cleanup. Even if you really thought you'd figured it out. We have talked to property owners who'd hired firms that went out and tested things and didn't find any discharge, didn't find any toxic problems in the soil, and it was given a clean bill of health, only to discover as soon as it rains, the discharge off that site doesn't usually, if it's a hydraulic mine site or other kinds of contaminated sites, can sometimes disobey the California toxics rule. You can have a water quality discharge and you have to abate it. Now you can go back and see if you can figure out somebody else you can bring into the formula that used to own the mine. If, however, you've made it worse by actually mining, there's just no way out of that liability. Soil and dusty exposures are somewhat different. If they don't leak off the property, you're not always going to be forced to clean it up. It might have contaminated soil, but if it's not a public, there's no reason for the public to be there. There's not usually a lot of pressure. It's just you can't subdivide it. You can't. You thought you were going to even just do a simple, split in half. No, not if it's got a little mine feature on the map, and then they look at this gravelly spot, and then they go test it and they find it high for arsenic or lead. You're not going to be able to subdivide that property in most cases, unless of course you can abate it and let you. So then you'd figure out what it is, where it is, how big it is, and liability, what's it going to cost to remediate it to do what you want it to do, and that would of course speak to appraisal, but also the use of the project. So these are the sort of the two big differences: water quality discharge. Even if you're not doing anything at all, if your property is discharging something that doesn't meet the Clean Water Act for California, you are going to be told you have to clean that up. And this is the many government agencies have discovered their properties are leaking, but so have many private property owners. What are the obstacles to clarifying liability? This piece is really very frightening for most people. Well, one is that the legal considerations around water quality, soil contamination, cultural resources protection are inconsistent. So in some cases, you might be, let's say you're doing a large landscape project that you want to buy the every other section of the forest, checkerboard section part of the forest up here. Well, that's a very disjointed, you might have a mine that starts on one property and you're looking at the downslope piece. You may not know that you're going to get discharged from an upstream property. So there's these parcel boundaries. Different counties have different standards for what kinds of requirements they pursue, but basically in all things toxic soil is Department of Toxic Substances Control is going to come in and work with your county. So but still working with the county or the city, multiple jurisdictions, multiple people coming and inspecting. So it might be hard to figure out what your problems are and who's going to enforce what. The second thing is the history of use on the property may not be well documented. So you don't have the handy maps and charts that sometimes we're able to find. And you might think it's all clean. You've gotten the clean bill of health from the soil testing. And then you get out there with your machine and you dig up a big bucket of soil, and there's the purple dirt of Nevada County, which shows that there was something that happened there that left a footprint that's going to need to be abated. So in our big case study that we did, where the Sierra Fund walked through every piece of this, We were very interested in understanding the liability on this property before we, with the Champion Mine property, before we suggested that it be used for a new public service other than big walls put around it. We didn't want to hand off property to a nonprofit of any kind if it had unknown liability. So not only did we hire the best assessment team, we got a targeted brownfields assessment from the EPA, and we had people out there doing really informed assessment. We also thought carefully about what we found. There was no water quality discharge from this property. You can have no water quality discharge on your property and then build a road, put in a culvert, and that culvert now collects water from your landscape and puts it through the culvert down into the water of the state of California. Now you may have a point source, because culverts are a point source according to the Water Board. If you have no man-made, human-made structures that take the water into the creek, generally you don't have a water quality discharge liability. But you could have contaminated soil. So in the case of the Champion Mine property, we looked at the maps, we went out and did this very, very informed sampling. There was an excellent assessment of the physical hazards done as well by the local engineering firm. And through the course of that, we didn't find a soil, we didn't find a discharge, but we did find contaminated soil in some very discrete spots. So that helped inform what's the best end use for this property. Because it's contaminated like this, it can't really be split. It really can't be split unless they're gonna, dig this stuff up and take it off to hazardous waste. So what's the proper end use? Well, that might suggest who's a good buyer. Is a nonprofit somebody who doesn't need to make money off of it a good buyer? Is it a government agency? Maybe they have a good use for it. A developer, maybe depending upon an extremely specific use, they could still possibly buy this compromised land. Because remember, the assessment's generally done by the owner of the property. The owner of the property is trying to figure out how they're going to sell it if they're trying to sell it to make money. So they're going to be thinking about who they're marketing this property to. What kind of buyer might it be? When you identify the buyer that you want to work with, especially on conservation or government type projects that aren't big developers being involved, you have to have an informed assessment. In the modern era, it's going to be willful negligence really to not do a good informed assessment of abandoned mines prior to sale. But if an informed assessment does require things like the proposed buyer getting access to the property to take their own samples. And this has been very controversial sometimes for conservation minded buyers, because the seller doesn't really want you to come on and find the big problem. They're not really incentivized for that. And so you have to get that clear, that you have the right to go on the property and do your own informed assessment. And who pays for that becomes an issue. Anything that's known about the property needs to be disclosed. So in our abandoned lava cap, the lava cap mine sample example we heard earlier, we have a really good example of a landowner who claimed he didn't even know that the Water Board had made these assertions about the debris control dam. Having walked around the property with staff, I know that issue was raised to these developers on that 1991 tour, but nevertheless, it was not disclosed in writing, apparently, on their paperwork. We also think that the agreement between the seller and the potential buyer might have to be kind of specialized. If the potential buyer wants to know about the informed assessment, they might need to be talking to the tribes themselves, because sometimes these are very delicate issues to discuss. So the agreement between the seller and the potential buyer needs to be very clear on these complex properties. Sometimes you want to orchestrate the conditions and timing of, especially an acquisition. You might say, look, we want to buy this after you've completed the following kinds of assessment, or after you removed this one contaminated part, then we'd be interested. So, or we want to acquire it for the purpose of cleaning it, and then we want to pass it on as a conservation activity. Maybe there's going to be a new niche in the market for that kind of a use. Finally, and we're going to talk about this a great deal more next week, address the potential liabilities in the project design. Don't create a Clean Water Act liability if you didn't start off with one. So we're back to our due diligence model. We've talked about how informed assessment impacts especially acquisition and appraisal. Again, next week, we're going to talk about project design and permitting, but we're still in the box in our world of action number one: improve informed assessment.